Some people were not hit. They were not screamed at every day. They were not always able to point to one dramatic moment and say, "That is what broke me." They were simply never fully seen, not chosen first, not asked twice if they were okay, not really noticed when they went quiet, not deeply missed when they pulled away. And that kind of childhood does something strange to a person. It does not always make them loud. Sometimes it makes them disappear without leaving the room. They become easy, low maintenance, independent, mature for their age. They stop asking for much. They learn how to read the emotional weather before speaking. They learn how to take up less space. They learn how to survive on scraps of attention and call it love. And later, people will look at them and think they are calm. But what they are really seeing is someone who learned very early that being noticed is not the same thing as being valued. Growing up unnoticed is a form of emotional neglect that people often minimize because it leaves no obvious scene behind. There is no single memory dramatic enough to explain the damage. It happens quietly. It happens when your feelings are skipped over, when your sadness is treated like inconvenience, when your excitement gets no reflection back, when nobody asks why your face changed, when you are physically present in a family but emotionally unhealed inside it. And the most dangerous part is that the child adapts. That is what makes this wound so hard to recognize. You do not look broken. You look functional. You look mature. You look self-sufficient. But under that adaptation, the nervous system learns a brutal lesson. Do not expect care. Do not need too much. Do not assume anyone is coming closer. And once that lesson settles in, it starts shaping everything. The way you love, the way you attach, the way you speak, the way you hide, the way you shrink in relationships without even realizing it. The first thing growing up unnoticed does to a person is teach them to hide their needs before they can even name them. Maybe you stopped asking for help too quickly. Maybe you learned that repeating yourself changed nothing. Maybe you started saying it's fine before checking whether it was. Later, that behavior looks like strength. It looks like emotional control. It looks like independence. But often, it is just survival wearing a respectable face. Because when a child keeps reaching and gets no real emotional response, the mind makes an adjustment. It does not erase the need. It buries the expression of it. And over time, unmet need begins to feel humiliating. That is the part people miss. The need never disappeared. It just turned into shame. So now as an adult, you may struggle to ask for reassurance, affection, support, clarity, tenderness, anything that could expose how much you actually feel. You wait. You hint. You minimize. You swallow the need and then feel crushed when nobody notices it. Not because you are manipulative, not because you want mind reading, but because needing was never made safe. And that damages love in a quiet but devastating way. You become hard to know. People assume you are okay when you are actually starving. Then one day you shut down, pull away, or break over something small, and even you do not fully understand why it hurt that much. But it was never just that moment. It was years of teaching yourself not to ask. And then something else happens. You become deeply aware of other people and strangely disconnected from yourself. Children who grow up unnoticed often become experts in reading the room. A sigh across the house, a shift in tone, a colder message, a delayed reply, a face that looks slightly more distant than usual. You notice everything, because when direct emotional attention is missing, The nervous system learns to survive through scanning. You become skilled at sensing tension, withdrawal, disappointment, rejection, mood changes, danger in subtle forms. That can look like intuition. Sometimes it is intuition. But there is a hidden cost. You become so trained to monitor everyone else that you lose contact with your own emotional reality. You know when someone is upset before they say it, but you do not know what you are feeling until it is already spilling out. You know how to keep connection stable, but you do not know where you are inside that stability. This is why emotionally neglected people can seem deeply perceptive and deeply lost at the same time. They can read everyone around them, but they cannot read their own hunger. So they adapt. They shapeshift. They become what the moment needs. They perform calm. They perform understanding. They perform flexibility. And over time, they disappear inside adaptation, not because they are fake. Because being fully themselves never felt safely received. Then love gets distorted. That is where the wound becomes even darker. When you grow up unnoticed, attention becomes emotionally charged. Small gestures hit harder than they should. Inconsistent care feels intimate. Bare minimum effort feels meaningful. Someone remembers one detail about you, and your whole body reacts like relief. Someone finally checks in on you, and you get attached too quickly. Someone is emotionally unavailable, but gives you occasional warmth, and suddenly they live in your head. Why does this happen? Because the neglected child inside you is still calibrated to scarcity. And scarcity changes the way love feels. It makes crumbs feel like a feast. It makes confusion feel like chemistry. It makes longing feel like depth. So you may find yourself drawn to toxic dynamics, overvaluing tiny signs of care, clinging to people who are inconsistent, mistaking obsession for intimacy, and calling emotional anxiety passion. Not because you enjoy pain, not because you are weak, but because your attachment system learned to bond around absence. When love was rare, unpredictability became familiar. Emotional distance became normal. The chase became proof that something mattered. And safe love, stable love, available love may feel strangely flat at first, not because it is empty, but because your body was trained to associate love with searching. This is where the pattern becomes cruel. People who grew up unnoticed often recreate the same position in adult life without realizing it. They do extra and ask for no credit. They care for everyone and hide their own limits. They wait to be chosen instead of clearly expressing themselves. They soften their opinions. They apologize before speaking. They make themselves emotionally undemanding. Then they wonder why they keep ending up unseen. But this is not random. It is conditioning. When a child learns that visibility does not lead to care, that child often stops fully showing up. They become less direct, less expressive, less inconvenient, less visible on purpose. They anticipate dismissal and adjust before it happens. And the world usually accepts that adjustment as truth. People assume they are fine. They assume they do not need much. They assume they will say something if it matters. But they do not say anything because some part of them is still running the same test they were running years ago. Will anyone notice if I go quiet? Will anyone come closer if I stop trying? Will anyone choose me without being asked? And when the answer is no, the old pain returns not as memory, but as identity. That is when people start thinking, maybe I am just forgettable. Maybe I am just hard to love. Maybe I do not leave an impact. But that was never the truth. That was the adaptation speaking. Over time, this reaches even deeper. You start believing that your inner world is too unimportant to share. That is how unnoticed children become emotionally isolated adults. Not always physically alone, emotionally alone. They may have friends. They may have a partner. They may be surrounded by people all the time, but their real inner life stays hidden. The shame is subtle. It sounds like, why would they care? It is not a big deal. I am probably overreacting. I should handle it myself. There is no point explaining, so they keep their pain private. They edit their stories. They tell the acceptable version. They reveal the polished wound, never the real one. And the tragedy is that the more unseen they feel, the harder it becomes to risk being seen. Because exposure starts to feel dangerous. If they show too much and it lands flat, the old injury gets confirmed again. So they protect themselves by staying partly hidden, then grieve the fact that nobody knows them deeply. That is how emotional neglect survives. It turns concealment into safety. Then it turns loneliness into routine. But the deepest damage is not just that you were unnoticed. It is that you may have built an entire personality around being easy to miss. That is the part almost nobody talks about. You call it independence. You call it privacy. You call it maturity. You call it not wanting to be a burden. And sometimes that is what it is. But sometimes it is a child's survival strategy wearing an adult's face. Because when no one consistently came close enough to study you, soothe you, stay curious about you, and reflect you back to yourself, you may have learned to split from your own importance. You stopped treating your feelings like urgent information. You stopped acting like your presence changed anything. You stopped believing your absence would hurt. So now you can be loved and still feel unconvinced, praised and still feel untouched, included and still feel outside. Because the original wound was not only loneliness, it was unmirrored existence. Nobody helped build the internal feeling of, I am here and I matter because I am being emotionally recognized. Nobody consistently reflected back, I see your fear, I see your joy, I see your anger, I see your needs, I see your difference, I see you. And without that reflection, a person can grow up with a quiet but persistent emptiness. Not always dramatic, not always visible. Just a strange feeling that they are somehow less real than everyone else. That emptiness becomes dangerous when it goes unnamed. It makes you accept less than you deserve. It makes you chase emotionally unavailable people. It makes self-sabotage feel normal. It makes you shrink before anyone even asks you to shrink. It makes loneliness feel like personality. It makes emotional neglect feel like identity. And that is where the wound becomes self-perpetuating. You stop asking for more because some part of you no longer believes more exists for you. You start thinking, this is just who I am. Quiet, hidden, hard to reach, easy to overlook. But that is not who you are. That is what you adapted into. And healing from this is not about becoming louder for performance. It is not about forcing confidence. It is not about turning yourself into someone intense just to prove you exist. Healing is more intimate than that. It is learning that a need is not a flaw, that taking up space is not aggression, that being visible is not the same thing as being too much, that attention and love are not identical, that your pain does not become valid only when someone finally notices it. And maybe the hardest part of all is this. You may have to stop waiting for people to magically detect everything you were forced to hide in order to survive, because the child in you still wants a perfect correction. Someone who notices every silence. Someone who catches every shift in your face. Someone who says, without being asked, I know you are not okay. And yes, sometimes that happens. Sometimes someone really does see you. But healing begins when your entire life stops depending on that miracle. It begins when you speak before you disappear. When you name the hurt before it turns into numbness. When you stop calling self-erasure maturity. When you stop confusing emotional neglect with proof that you are unimportant. Because growing up unnoticed does change a person. It can make them quiet, hyper-aware, anxious, ashamed of their needs, drawn to toxic relationships, hungry for validation, and afraid of being fully seen. It can make them obsessed with crumbs of love. It can make them feel invisible even when they are surrounded by people. But that is not all it makes them. It can also make them deeply perceptive, emotionally precise, able to detect pain other people miss, able to understand loneliness in a way that is almost surgical. And when that same person finally turns that attention inward, something begins to change. They stop disappearing to be loved. They stop starving in rooms full of people. They stop waiting to be discovered like some hidden object. They become visible to themselves first. And for some people, that is the first real beginning of a life that actually feels like their own. If this video found something in you that you have never been able to explain, subscribe to Shadow Depths. This channel is for the hidden patterns, the silent wounds, and the darker psychology people carry alone. And if this hit close, leave a comment with one word: unseen.